Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tom Schreier, and I have the privilege of being the founding director of the Inspired Leadership Initiative here at the University of Notre Dame. For those of you that aren't familiar with the program, it's a program in its second year here at the university, which brings individuals from a wide variety of backgrounds who finished their chosen careers here to Notre Dame for a full academic year to discern, design, and equip themselves for their next act with a true purpose and part of a broader community. Many of you have probably seen these ILI fellows around campus. In fact, one of the many great joys I have in my role is seeing our fellows engaging across generations with students and generatively also with faculty here in the library, at the Duncan Student Center, and across campus. For those of you that haven't seen them, I will ask them to stand here quickly and you get a little sense of what they look like. So I'm going to ask our fellows and former fellows to stand up that are here and present with us today. They're truly a group of trailblazing, non-traditional students that are immersing themselves into this campus just as the undergrads and graduate students do. One of the things we've realized is that the Inspired Leadership Initiative is part of a much broader movement, bringing purpose and connectivity across generations. We are most fortunate to have two thought leaders in this space here with us today, Marc Freedman and Chris Farrell. Marc Freedman, just to my right here, is the president, CEO, and founder of Encore.org. He's a renowned social entrepreneur who has pioneered innovative programs across the globe to connect generations and tap into the talent and experience of people past midlife. His most recent book is How to Live Forever, the enduring power of connecting the generations. Chris Farrell, two to my right, is the senior economics contributor at American Public Media's Marketplace, which is a nationally syndicated program covering business and economics. His most recent book is Purpose and a Paycheck, Finding Meaning, Money, and Happiness in the Second Half of Life. Both of these gentlemen are committed to harnessing the power across generations to solve the world's most vexing problems. Or, as we would say here at the University of Notre Dame, becoming a force for good. I am confident you will greatly enjoy their presentation and the opportunity to interact with them afterwards over lunch. I ask you all to extend a warm Notre Dame welcome to Marc and Chris.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Tom. And since we're at Notre Dame, I just want to start off with a story. So when I was growing up, there were these three remarkable women in the background of our family, Aunt Julia, Aunt Agnes, and Aunt Ella. And they were nuns of the Sister of Charity of New York. And we loved them. They were wonderful. And the thing is, even at 6 years old, they were really interested in what you were thinking you had to say. And one of them in particular stood out, Aunt Ella. And later on, I realized what a remarkable career she had had. She managed an orphanage in upstate New York during World War II, and then after the war worked at Mount St. Vincent and taught mathematics and was an administrator, and she built parochial schools on Long Island, and she testified before Congress in the early 1970s in the successful effort to bring the nuns into the Social Security system. So the last time I saw Aunt Ella, it's always struck with me, is she was staying at the Convent of Mary the Queen in Yonkers. It was an old age home for nuns in Yonkers. And as always with Aunt Ella, you'd walk around and talk about family and education and public policy and poverty and what were you doing. But the thing that always struck me was when she signaled it was time for me to go. And she said, Chris, I have to go take care of the elderly. There's work to be done. Now, Aunt Ella was 96 years old. And the thesis of Purpose and a Paycheck is that Aunt Ella was a remarkable person. But Aunt Ella's statement, her purpose is going to become normal and is becoming normal. And we're living in a society that, with the demographics of aging, that we're making a fundamental shift toward an older population. So this is not just reflecting the baby boom generation, much as the baby boom generation might want to think that it's reflecting them, but this is a shift that we're living longer on average and we're having fewer children. And so there's this, I think, remarkable forecast from the Census Bureau that in 2035, for for the first time in US history, there are going to be more people 65 years and older than 18 years and younger. And this is a shift in our society. Now, if you mention this in most circles, you're going to get a pretty dire reaction, a pretty depressing reaction. Because, look, all these dependent elderly, and they're not very creative, and the ones who want to work, they're stuck in their ways, they're not going to offer very much. And so whether you're in Washington, D.C., or you're on Wall Street, the forecast is, what the demographics of aging leads to is a less dynamic economy. It's going to be an economy where we have way too many of these dependent elderly supported by way too few of young workers. And the thing is, that may be conventional wisdom. That may be the common reaction, but it is fundamentally wrong. And instead, what we have is an unbelievable opportunity to rejuvenate our economy, rejuvenate our organizations, and rejuvenate our communities. And there is a wide body of research by neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, scholars of creativity, sociologists, economists, who have looked into aging, and when you start gathering together all the information, you come up with a very different picture of what it means to be older. And when you come up with a picture is that people who are creative in their 20s are creative in their 60s, creative in your 30s, you're creative in your 70s. And that people can become more and more productive as they become older because of the benefits of experience and of knowledge and the development of skill. And that an aging population has so much to offer to our economy and our society and the workplace, so long as they're given the opportunity. And this is not just an abstract discussion. There's this grassroots social movement where people are working longer. And I don't think it's recognized enough, but just to give you a couple of numbers. So you take the 65 to 69-year-old age group, and you look at men. Back in April 1996, the labor force participation rate was 28%. So in April 2019, the labor force participation rate of men 65 to 69 was 39%. The comparable numbers for women were 18% back in 1996 and 30% in 2019. Then if you look at entrepreneurship, that's youth, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, for a previous generation, Bill Gates with Microsoft, and the late Steve Jobs with Apple Computer. 26% of new entrepreneurs in 2017 was the 55 to 64-year-old age group, and that's up from 15% in 1996. So what we're seeing is an emergence where people are living longer, they have more to contribute to society, and they are contributing a lot more to our economy. And there's a number of reasons why people are working longer. For one thing, they're better educated. And actually, when you look at the forecasts, like the Urban Institute does these very long-range forecasts, the millennial generation is even better educated than the baby boom generation. So you even see more positive effects. But we're better educated on average, we're healthier on average, and the economy has also changed in certain fundamental ways. So we live in an economy dominated by services and information technologies. So it'd be one thing if we were having this conversation and like back in the 50s and 60s when smokestack America dominated. And the assembly line, the mine, fishing. Well, now it's an economy that's dominated by services. And so changes in our economy encourage a longer work life. The other thing is and I think this is underappreciated, is that the workplace is a community. People care whether you show up. You gossip. There are people you don't like. It's a community. There are people you do like. And the thing is, if you look at the surveys that people who have retired, and I believe Encore also did a survey you were talking about the other day, people are retired, and you sort of say, well, what do you most miss about what you did before? It's, money is on that list, but it's usually pretty far down the list. What's always at the top of the list, colleagues, suppliers, vendors, my customers. It's people. It's that sense of community. And the other thing is, with time, the rise of retirement, mass retirement, was a great innovation because until World War II, most people worked fairly close till they died. And then we had this incredible innovation of being able to retire. But I think with time, people have realized the notion that through all the ups and downs of your career, all the skill, all the knowledge, all the experience that you gain, that at some point arbitrary, age 60, age 62, age 65, you say goodbye to that for the rest of your life, and you never tap into that skill anymore. You never use your experience again is not attractive to people. And then on sort of the negative side is we have a retirement savings system that has a lot of holes in it. So a lot of people are nearing their retirement years and they don't have much in savings. And part of it has to do with we don't have a very good retirement savings system. Part of it has to do is life is expensive. Kids are really expensive to raise. And it's really hard to save money. And so the personal finances of working longer really do affect the balance sheet. And one of the most powerful effects of that is that if the Social Security benefit for the typical worker is more than 75% higher if you file at age 70, the last year you file, versus filing at age 62, the earliest year that you can file. And then during that period of time, as you delay filing, you can add to your savings, or at least you're not tapping into your savings as you were before. So there's a lot of reasons coming together why people are working longer. And one of the things is that has been blocking people are these generational stereotypes, right? And you know them all. These old people, they want to learn new technologies. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. They're stuck in their ways. They're grumpy. All kinds of stuff. But the thing is, they are creative. And that's exactly what the research really does tell us. So back in 2016, I think it was, I went to New York City. I live in the Twin Cities. Went to New York City. There's an exhibit of Matisse. And it was his cutouts, those famous cutouts. And, the Blue Nude series and the swimming pool. And there's remarkable photographs. And Matisse did it the last decade of his life, so 74 to 84. And he did them from a wheelchair in his bed. And the reason why I came up with the cutouts is because he had some serious disabilities. And so he essentially reinvented what children do into this incredible art form. But the thing is, once you start looking around at artists and you realize more and more artists actually do their most creative work as they get older. And you realize more and more writers are doing their most creative work as they get older. And then if you think about skilled machinists, they become more and more skilled with time as they get older. And you can sort of see it in so many professions. And so this notion that people aren't creative, it's less that they're not given the opportunity to be creative on the workplace. And one of the reasons why I think we're seeing so much entrepreneurship going on with in the second half of life, the last third of life, is entrepreneurship is creative. And, part of it happens, someone gets laid off. It's hard to get a job when you're 59, 60 years old. But you have skill, you have knowledge, and you start your own business. But also it's just part of our culture, the American culture. This sort of, everyone has kind of in the back of their mind, maybe I might want to start a business. I got this idea. And the kids are out of the house, and you're not risking, by the way, your 401k, your 403b to your business idea. Most of the businesses that are being started by the 65 plus or 60 plus is $5,000 or less. The real investment is time. And often they're taking a passion, some craft, some artisan skill that they have, and they're creating a business. But it's an incredibly creative activity. So I was down in Sarasota, Florida. I met Jean Cannon, and she was in her early 70s when I first met her. And she had a career at IBM, and then she retired from IBM. And when I walked into her townhouse, she was sort of laughing because she was trying to learn WordPress. Now, she had learned MailChimp and Facebook and Instagram, and she was trying to learn WordPress. And she was laughing because at IBM, she would call the help desk, and the help desk would come and solve the problem for her. She had to solve the problem on her own, but the thing is she was solving the problem on her own. And what she was trying to create was using the web to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem for Sarasota, for the town of Sarasota, to attract more young entrepreneurs to move in the town, and to attract the older generation who had an entrepreneurial bent to match up with the younger entrepreneurs to create more businesses, to create more jobs, so that Saratoga, which has an unusually older population here in the United States, would have a more vibrant economy. And another example just to throw out there was Rick Harris. And Rick Harris lives in the Twin Cities, grew up in segregated Texas, went to California and was 20, saw the future, went back to Texas, packed up the car, drove to California. And he worked in a variety of factories, variety of jobs. He had a small business in the Bay Area. And what his business was, in Silicon Valley, a lot of small firms, they fail. So then a new firm's going to come in there. He'd come there at night, and it was commercial interior. They'd rip out what was in there, put it into the new design. New business would move in there. 2008, 2009 happens. Business is drying up, and his wife gets a job offered to be the headmaster at a private high school. She takes the job. He moves there. The kids are out of the house. And he wants to restart his business in the Twin Cities. It's not going well. It's hard. It's hard to break into. And so he's 61, 62 years old, and he's thinking maybe it's about time to retire. And then his son, Tim, comes to him, who had graduated from college, and says, Dad, I want to go into business with you. I want to learn how to be an entrepreneur. And he's completely rejuvenated. And the revenues have gone up by threefold. They're doing well. And it's like a classic experience. His son's got the ambition, he's got the hustle, but he doesn't have the knowledge. The dad, he's got the knowledge, he's got a little bit of capital to throw in there. And so they're working together in this sort of multi-generational enterprise. And so, this is the kind of creative activity that is going on. And this notion that you don't have anything to offer because you're 73 years old, because you're 61, 62 years old, is just completely wrong. And the other thing is, the older worker is a productive worker. We have this notion that the older worker just doesn't want to, they kind of slack around and, look around and they're waiting to retire. And yet, what it turns out is exactly the opposite. I mean, these are stereotypes. So there was a study series of studies in Germany, Max Planck Institute, and they got access to Mercedes-Benz truck factory. And in that truck factory, they were measuring productivity. And what they found is that productivity peaked pretty much around age 65 when someone retired. Of course, they had no data after that point, right? And what they also found is that the multi-generational teams were the most productive teams. And so many businesses have now moved toward teams. And the reason for that is, the younger people have a little bit of hustle. They're willing to really run around a little bit more. But the older workers was, hey, I've seen this, done that. Here's how you might be able to solve this problem. And so the notion that the older worker is not a productive worker, I think is fundamentally wrong. And so really the challenge for our society is to be breaking down the barriers of ageism, be breaking down a lot of the barriers of these stereotypes that are preventing people from exercising their creativity and their productivity and to have the opportunities. How many people have been in a meeting where somebody is sitting there and going, I can't remember that company's name. I'm having a senior moment. I mean, how many people sat, these things are almost, they're there, and they're almost in the background that people aren't even aware of it. So it's fighting ageism. Now, one of the things that I do think is happening, and it's exciting, is because of this tight labor market, and you cannot meet a manager, a CEO, head of an organization that is not complaining about the lack of qualified workers and the lack of their ability to find qualified workers. And it's always puzzled me because I go, well, if you give me 2 weeks, I have a line outside your door of 50 and older qualified workers who are skilled. We are starting to see this change happening. And I don't think it's really happening yet because of enlightenment. It's happening at this particular point in time because if you want to fulfill this contract, if you want to grow your business, Minnesota has medium-sized high-tech firms, manufacturing firms that are sort of on the skilled level. I was interviewing a bunch of them in those companies, and they are investing in automation. And the reason why they were investing in automation was not to replace their workers, it was to keep their 60-plus workers on the payroll. Because those 60-plus workers are the ones that are training the younger workers coming out of the community colleges, the technical colleges, because there's a big gap in a lot of these firms, not too many people in their 40s and 50s. And so they're investing in automation to keep the skill around. Now, it wasn't because they were sitting around and saying age discrimination is wrong. They were sitting around because we have to fulfill this contract and we have to keep this person on the payroll in order to do these contracts. But then again, I think it will shift the way we think about an aging population from when are you going to retire to what can we do to keep you around? Phased retirement, part-time work, flexible schedule, how can we work together in order to build this economy better? And so I also think that there are enormous opportunities. Just one number that, if you look at the economy, 7.6 trillion of direct and indirect economic activity was generated by the 50-plus population. And this is just the US economy alone. So there's just enormous opportunities here, both for the older worker, but also for the older worker and marketing to the older worker. And this is where there is starting to be more capital, venture capital money is starting to pour into this area because of the size of the market and that this market is going to continue to work and it's going to contribute to our society. And so just on one last note that I want to mention is one of the most pernicious myths that's out there and is this notion of intergenerational conflict. And you hear about it all the time, right? And the generations are butting up against each other. And the fact is, when you look at the survey data, the shared values are much stronger. And I think a lot of the differences are that you're at different stages of life. I'm shaped by the Vietnam War. And I work with some people for whom the Iraq War is something learned about in the history books. But that's what diversity and inclusion is all about, bringing these diverse experiences. So the aging of the population is not doom and gloom. The aging of the population is an incredible opportunity to seize if we want this economy to grow faster, to grow richer, and to have a more diverse, inclusive economy. Mark?
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to go off script for a minute just because as Chris was talking about his aunts, I was thinking about the great mentor in my life who was a guy by the name of John W. Gardner, who was a friend and colleague and contemporary of Father Hesburgh's. And so I guess I was thinking about him as I came through the doors of the library today. And John used to tell a wonderful story. When he was in his 70s, he remembers getting a call from his mother, who was 100, and she said, "This whole aging thing has really got me down. I am really depressed about it." And he said, "Mom, you've got all your faculties, you're sharp as a tack, you have all these people who love you." And she said, no, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about you and your brother." But she had no reason to be depressed because John won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. It's the ultimate gold watch. It's the highest civilian honor you can win. He'd been president of the Carnegie Corporation during the 50s. He was behind the creation of the White House Fellows Program, PBS, all kinds of important and enduring things. But in fact, as Chris laid out, all of his most important work lay ahead after he had gotten his gold watch. He was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare from 65 to 68, architect of much of the Great Society. He then went on to found Common Cause, and on and on and on. And I met him because I had been focusing on young people and their needs and had particularly been interested in mentoring, done a study with others of the Big Brother, Big Sister program, which showed that these kind of bonds were all important for young people, but that programs like Big Brothers, Big Sisters had huge shortages. And we're asking this question of, where are the human beings to do the things that only people can do? And John had the idea that older people were the answer and had written a concept paper to create an experience corps of older people who would do that work with younger generations. And we met, and together we forged this program. And he would have been proud of what happened because it showed that, in fact, there were very powerful and natural bonds between generations. There's all kinds of research from Johns Hopkins Medical School, from Washington University in St. Louis, and other researchers showing that this program was a win-win. Young people got a tremendous amount out of it. There's recent Hopkins Medical School research that shows that participating in Experience Corps, which is kind of a Peace Corps for comprised of older people and focused on kids reading by the 3rd grade that older people who participate in Experience Core, the program reverses the preconditions of dementia. So there are huge benefits. But, you know, as the years have passed, one of the questions that's haunted me is why we even need a program like Experience Core. Why doesn't this just happen in the context of daily life? And I ended up writing this book with the very understated title, How to Live Forever, that Tom mentioned earlier, that was really very much focused on that question of age segregation and why we don't have more opportunities for the generations to come together in mutually beneficial fashion. And it turns out that for me, the key turning point was the year 1956. When John Gardner won that Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964, he was joined by all kinds of dignitaries, T.S. Eliot, Carl Sandburg, Tom Watson, the founder of IBM, and a guy by the name of Lewis Mumford, who was our greatest critic of architecture and urban life in the 20th century, long forgotten, the New Yorker's architectural critic for 30 years, the person who put the Chicago School of Architecture on the map, discovered Louis Sullivan, and Louis Sullivan's chief draftsman, a guy by the name of Frank Lloyd Wright. You may have heard of him. And in 1956, Lewis Mumford was 61 years old. He would win that Presidential Medal of Freedom in 8 years, but he was already at the top of his game. And he wrote a cover story in Architectural Record, the preeminent architectural magazine then and now. And it wasn't about architecture, it was about aging. And it was written by a 61-year-old. And the first line was that at no point in any society had any group been so rejected as older people today. I finished that first paragraph by saying, yes, we've added all these years to life, but we added them at the wrong end of life. And it echoed a statement in a speech by Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, a few years earlier, in which he described retirees as too old to work, too young to die. And so things were pretty despairing for older people, and Mumford had first of all, he said, you know, we got to fix this. And he said, here's how we can do it. The first thing is, whatever we do, don't infantilize older people. Don't turn later life into a second childhood. And the second thing, and went to the title of the article, which was, for older people, not segregation, integration. And that very same year, outside of Phoenix in Peoria, Arizona, a guy by the name of Big Ben Schleifer, like Mumford, a New Yorker, who'd moved to the Arizona desert because he had asthma and had to leave his beloved New York, no less idealistic than Mumford, was returning to New York regularly to see an elderly friend in a nursing home who was isolated, rejected, forlorn, and every time Big Ben Schleifer would see him, he would get angrier and angrier, and he decided to do something about it. And on this last trip, he returns to Phoenix and decides to create the first age-segregated retirement community in America called Youngtown. And whereas Mumford had said, stay away from turning older people into, you know, ersatz, fake young people, and by all means, integrate, not segregate. Big Ben Schleifer decided to create a kibbutz in the desert. He was Jewish, he was a socialist, exclusively for older people, convinced that there was no place for older people in a youth-obsessed American society. And he created a place where you could be young again, hence the name Youngtown. And he partly made it age segregated because he wanted it to be affordable for somebody living on Social Security. But it turns out that these two components, the attempt to recapture a sort of false youth and age segregation, went together hand in glove. If everybody was old, nobody was old. There wasn't the annoying presence of real children to remind you that you weren't one. And I don't have to tell you whose vision captured the American imagination. The next year, Youngtown was featured on Dave Garroway's Wide Wide World TV show in the morning, watched by 4 million people. One of them was a guy by the name of Delbert E. Webb, who created Sun City directly across the street from the 125 homes in Youngtown. I think there's 70,000 people living in Sun City today. And he invented the phrase the golden years, and in the process transformed the dream for later life, really the American dream. And this was a major turning point in a bigger unfolding that happened during the 20th century. So America began the 20th century as the most age-integrated society in the world. In the 19th century, we didn't even know how old we were. People didn't celebrate birthdays. The birthday song, Happy Birthday to You, that was invented in 1934. Knowing somebody's age would be like knowing their blood type today. You'd never even think to ask. Every aspect of society was age integrated. We worked on farms, older and younger, shoulder to shoulder, lived in multi-generational households. And we ended the 20th century, the most age-segregated society in the world, in a state of age apartheid, in the description of one person. And we essentially rerouted the river of life, created a society that goes against the grain of everything we know about human evolution and human development. And in the process, we've inflicted upon ourselves a grievous wound. We didn't do it for nefarious reasons. So we reshuffled the deck of society because we wanted to be more efficient. Universal schooling, child labor laws led to young people going into exclusively age-grouped institutions. Social Security, the great triumph of social policy of the last century, explicitly had the goal of getting older people out of the workforce. We created all these institutions like Youngtown and Sun City, senior centers, nursing homes for older people, all out of the idea that we would be more efficient. But what was narrowly efficient was globally a significant problem. In fact, Youngtown became Exhibit A for how this all could go wrong. 40 years after it was opened, it was in the national press again, but not in a fawning Dave Garroway portrait. It was in the New York Times because they were ejecting a pair of grandparents for the crime of harboring their grandson. 16-year-old Chaz Cope, who was a victim of abuse from his stepfather, had no place to go, but his grandparents in Youngtown. Did the community band together and bring them lasagna? And, they planted a scarlet letter-like sign on their lawn, harboring children, fined them $100 a day until they drove them out. The New York Times pointed out that at Youngtown, dogs were allowed, not kids. And now, is it any surprise, as Chris alluded to, in the most age-segregated society in the world, that we're worried about generational war, kids versus canes? Is it any shock in the most age-segregated society in the world that ageism is rampant? Because age segregation is the soil in which ageism is born and sustained. Is it any surprise that the former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has argued that loneliness is the greatest public health epidemic in America today, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and that the two loneliest groups are older people and younger ones. And so that's a problem, but again, to go back to Chris's point about the new demographics, it's utterly unsustainable in a society that's going to have more people over 65 than under 18. In fact, 2019 was the first year where we had more people over 60 than under 18. So we gotta fix it, like Lewis Mumford was saying, and we can fix this because one thing I learned over all of these years doing this work is that the needs and the assets of the generations fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. I learned it when I was working on mentoring Yuri Bronfenbrenner, one of the preeminent child psychologists of the 20th century, the co-founder of Head Start, professor at Cornell for many years. At the end of his life was asked, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, have you written 24 books, 1,000 articles, what did you learn? He said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And I think as the more I've studied development in later life, I realized that we need to be irrationally crazy about the next generation. One of the most important studies of adult development, the Harvard study of adult development, in its 83rd year, the two most significant findings is, first of all, relationships are all important. George Vaillant, the psychiatrist who led the study for 40 years, says happiness is love, full stop. And then he goes on and says there's a direction to all that connection. The study finds that older people who connect with younger ones, again, to just underscore what Chris was saying about this false notion of some natural conflict between the generations, older people who mentor younger ones, who connect with them, who support them, are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And he says it's not a passing fad, it's deeply rooted in the fiber of being a human being. Biology flows downhill. It's my favorite quote from him. So we got, the benefit of human development. It's a lot easier to flow downhill than swim upstream, but we're in the midst of a renaissance now of entrepreneurs, many of them older, many of them teams of older and younger people who are really trying to bring back more natural connections between the generations. I spent a couple years traveling around the world looking at examples of what was happening. And one of my favorites, Chris actually put me onto, is a program in the UK called Now Teach, started by Lucy Kellaway, this beloved journalist at the Financial Times, who at the age of 58, inspired by her daughter doing the British equivalent of Teach for America, wrote a column saying, I'm quitting my job, and a year from now I'm going to be in front of an East London classroom teaching low-income kids. And then she did something that not any role model in the United States, any paragon like Jimmy Carter or Bill Gates or Oprah has done. She challenged her readers to quit their jobs and to join her, and 1,000 people signed up for what were 20 slots. And one of the great things about it is that she formed an alliance with a 28-year-old PhD in education, Katie Waldegrave, and this great intergenerational entrepreneurship effort in which Katie runs the program, and Lucy's one of the workers in teaching. And there are all kinds of phenomenal things that are happening in communities around the country. Here, one of my favorite is in the housing arena at a place called Judson Manor in Cleveland, where I went on a cold November day a couple years ago, and there were 25 Swedish social scientists and social reformers already there, coming to the Rust Belt in the middle of the winter to find a better way to organize society. And so when the Scandinavians are coming to Cleveland, that's something's going on. And the reason they were there is a program at Judson Manor, this kind of upscale retirement community perched between the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western University, where on almost a whim, they had started providing free housing to graduate music students at the nearby conservatory because they loved music, and these students needed cheaper housing. But what began with efficiency ended up unfolding in surprising directions. I met a woman there, a 93-year-old woman, Carla, who lived next door to a young violist who became engaged while she was living at Judson Manor to another young violist. And when they were planning their wedding, they didn't invite Carla. They asked her to be the maid of honor. So just a glimpse of what is possible. And there's so many other powerful examples, many of them involving nuns. To go back to Chris's aunt's Providence Mount St. Vincent assisted living CCRC community in West Seattle, 400 older people, 85 of them retired nuns, decided on each of its 4 floors to have a preschool. And in an effort to create an age-integrated neighborhood, it's been so successful, there's a waiting list of 500 children to try to get into this preschool, where they have this army of grandparents waiting for them. Another, in the you can't make this stuff up category is an effort we gave a prize to last year called Nuns and Nuns. And it's a group of NONES millennials who check none in religious affiliation when they get the survey, but who are spiritually inclined, want to live a good life, who were involved in creating a better world, who've sought out older women religious who've spent their whole life at that work, like Chris's aunts, and formed meetups in 27 communities. And the nuns, in many cases, their orders are shrinking, even dying out. They have all of this real estate. They want their work to live on, even if it lives on in a different form. And these very deep ties have formed. In fact, they recently did a 3-month residency at the Mercy Center, the Sisters of Mercy Center in Burlingame, California, to figure out how they could work together, and have decided to go to the border to work on refugee issues, these nuns and nuns. And so just underscores the entrepreneurial opportunity that we have in front of us, and really the imperative to fix this. I think we need a new ethos. Instead of graying as playing, I prefer something along the lines of, rather than trying so hard to be young, we need to be there for those who actually are. We need an emphasis on entrepreneurship and innovation. We need to be as creative about bringing the generations together as we've been about splitting people up. And I think in fixing this, we can make ourselves happy. One of the things I discovered, pouring through all this research, is that the real fountain of youth isn't in some Silicon Valley test tube. The real fountain of youth is the fountain with youth. It's through these connections. And I think in the process connect to a fundamental part of the human experience that we've been in danger of squandering as we become so segregated by age, which is that older and younger people need each other in this endless, unfolding, timeless and timely thing called the cycle of life. And Lewis Mumford had a beautiful line about that. He said, every generation revolts against its parents and falls in love with its grandparents. But here was a case where, a rare case where he wasn't the first. I mean, this is a truth that every faith tradition, every culture has understood until we screwed things up about 50 years ago. But I'll just leave you with my favorite articulation of that, which is the Greek proverb, society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. And I can think of no better benediction for how we can make the most of this multi-generational world of more people over 60 or 65 than under 18, 4 or 5 generations in the workplace together. And that creates an imperative to do things very differently than we have been over the last century. Thanks.
Yeah. So what we'd love to do is open it up to your questions, and we have a microphone here, I believe, so if you just want to get Lauren's attention, if you have a question for us.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a question about language, because I think it communicates our thoughts, but it forms so much of what we think about in the ideas. And so I'm captured by what you talked about, but curious as to what words you use on the older. Like you talked about older, or quoted people saying it's an older generation, but instead of saying retirees or people who are in the golden years, how do you use language to call these various groups in the different generations in a way that is breaking the barriers and not referencing senior moments as a negative thing?
Mm-hmm.
So the vocabulary is shifting. And we don't, as you said, we really don't have a good vocabulary for how do we describe this time of life. So there was a very fun essay in the Washington Post by Laura Cardison, and she is director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. And she said, she's just been trying to convince people to use the word old. Just old is just kind of a neutral term. But nobody likes that. So she gave up. So she realized this is a lost cause. So she has a friend who's in the fashion industry, and she uses the term perennials. So Laura has been saying we should call older people perennials. And I just can't get my mind wrapped around calling people a plant or a flower. I mean, I just can't do this. So it's easier to say what people are turning away from. If you want to, the word senior, we haven't come up, but senior center is actually not going to be a phrase used anymore. There's a huge rejection of the word senior. Elder has been rejected because, elder's okay, but it has a very patriarchal message to it. People don't particularly like elderly. That's why a lot of times I'll say experienced workers or an older worker, because to me that's fairly neutral. We still use the word retirement years because it signals what kind of time of life we're talking about. It carries its own connotation, but PBS Next Avenue now says second half of life. That's 50 and over, second half of life. Although technically, it's not it's really not the second half of life. The Brits like the last third of life. So there is a sort of a conversation going on. The American Medical Association, I think it was, they've issued what they want researchers is to, whenever possible, use age. So simply saying people 65 to 75. So it's in flux. People aren't quite sure. We don't have a good vocabulary for it. It's easier to say, if you want to turn people off, use the word senior, use the word boomer, use the word geezer, talk about the silver tsunami, that type of thing.
I was talking last night, we had a gathering about a guy by the name of G. Stanley Hall, who was the founder of sort of psychology in America, and in his 80s he wrote an article saying we should invent a new stage of life between midlife and old age, and he had been the class poet in his college, and he described it as an Indian summer, which I kind of liked. But I just happened to be standing across a laundry hamper from my estimable mother-in-law, who is great with words and whips through the Times crossword puzzle on Sunday. And so a few years ago, I asked her, Donna, you got to help me answer this question. She said, oh, no problem, that she and her sister had already come up with the solution. And so I so what should you call this breed? She said, I'm on my next to last dog. And she had a schnauzer at the time, and I thought that was just great. And then the dog suddenly died. I got very nervous, so I went to one of these websites that tells how long you're going to live, and I put in all her information. It said she was going to live to 97, and I was greatly relieved. I told her about it. She went and did the same thing and got 96 and said there are things about her life that I should not know. So, but now I told another friend who, and she's really picked this up. She told me she's on her next to last refrigerator. So fortunately, the refrigerators seem to have a lot of durability these days.
I was just curious, are there certain industries that you think are more ripe for individuals who are in their second act or in the second phase of their life to stay involved in working or volunteer positions?
So I say in terms of, there are some industries where if you look at the hospital sector, for example, there's been a huge shift where they offer a lot of their workers increased flexibility. Do you want to work 0.8? Do you want to work 0.6? So there's been a real shift in the sort of hospital industry toward being more, because they don't want people to retire. They've invested a lot in the skill, a lot of knowledge, but they recognize that people might want to move on to a more flexible schedule. So that industry really has made a fundamental shift in its approach. What it really boils down to is how tight is your labor market. So there's a wonderful example, Carol Heimowitz, she's a journalist with Bloomberg, and she did this story last year where Hollywood is where boomers are in enormous demand. Now you would not think about Hollywood and boomers in enormous demand, but what it is the rise of this technology, streaming. So Netflix did 700 original shows last year. And what they have found out is they need people who know how to work in a writing room, know how to meet deadline, know how to do the audio, know how to do the video. This isn't the people in front of the camera. It's the whole infrastructure that goes into creating a show on time that meets its various deadlines. And so in that industry now, if you were a script writer and you had hit your 50s 10 years ago, she has all these quotes, 10 years ago the phone never rang. Now they're 60, and they're turning down work. So I think a lot of it has to do with how tight is labor. I think Marc Marc's done this incredible work with some high-tech industries with Encore fellowships. So you're nearing retirement, you still want to be doing something, and you can describe it better than I can. But that's an industry where there's zero unemployment, and so they're more willing to do some things. They're deeply prejudiced against hiring older workers, but if their older workers are on the payroll, they're more willing to work with them in terms of staying engaged.
Yeah, it's you're invoking of Hollywood. In a way, this program, the Encore Fellows program, it's basically a real life incarnation of the intern. So far we've had 2,000 of these fellows, but they get to play Robert De Niro in real life, and they essentially become interns in their 50s or 60s. And the interest on the part of these companies was to provide graceful exits for people. And there are all kinds of ways you can critique them for it, but Intel, IBM, HP, Cisco have been some of the companies, and it's a 1-year fellowship for people who've reached retirement age in that industry, half-time, $30,000 roughly a year, to use the skills that you developed in your years at those companies in a nonprofit organization as a springboard for having a second act that's focused on the greater good, and the companies see it as a way of expanding their philanthropic footprint. But Intel, for example, has pledged that every retirement-eligible employee in America who wants to do one of these fellowships and is placed can do so. They pay the full amount. They've invested tens of millions of dollars into it. We've had 1,000 fellows from Intel alone. And one of the surprises, to continue the Robert De Niro analogy, that they've ended up mentoring the executive directors of the organizations, even though that wasn't a formal part of the program. That's been one of the surprises. So the De Niro Anne Hathaway relationship is actually based in, I think, this natural intergenerational connection that's happened in these organizations.
Yep.
I just couldn't resist saying that in the second half of life, we happen to be running a public radio station that is the most listened to for that particular community. So I look forward to some of the words you're saying, that we might continue to have a good audience enjoying our station. But I'm curious in how this evolves. Many cultures, not ours, have traditionally been very supportive of the seniors in their communities. How do you see that as a migration that might occur to where there is more respect for senior, sorry, using the wrong word, the 50 pluses in any community, and how that can maybe become a much more, as you were describing it, a more sense of normalcy or even respect?
Well, before Chris gives you a real answer, I heard David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, talk recently, and he was joking that, when he does a book signing, somebody, who's in their 80s will come up and say, oh, I congratulations on all that work you're doing on PBS. I don't watch that, but my mother loves it. So the hope may go on and on.
Well, I think a couple things. So one of the things that's really striking, and this is from Pew Research. So in 1980, multi-generational households in the US bottomed out around 12% of the population. And it's now up to 20% of the population live in multi-generational households. And a lot of this reflects immigration. But it also reflects, and I think there's been a disservice in the way people talked about younger generation moving back into their parents, the boomerang, as if this is something wrong. This is a bad thing. You were a failure because you moved back into your household. And yet the fundamental economics of living together are really powerful, and it can make a lot of sense. Plus, the way we were raised, get out of the house as soon as possible, and you can come back for the summer, but that's about it, right? But you're talking about a 1,500 square foot home, a family of 6, and 1 bathroom, right? Well, now, if you look at the average home, you're talking 2,500 square feet, has 2 bathrooms. It's a very different the household is a very different economic situation. So I do think that there is part of where the immigration is affecting that some of it, that it really actually makes sense to have the multi-generational household, particularly as the parents are getting older and the younger generation is having children, and it works both ways. So I think the underlying economics of this are actually quite strong. And we're also, I think, beginning to realize how important it is to be living near people we know. You know, they may not be family, but living people we know. So the data, I think, only goes back to 1980. You might know. But in 1980, 15% of people who retired moved across state lines. It's now down to 5%. And a majority of people who retire stay within a 100-mile radius. They live in the same county that they retire in. And I think what this is recognizing is, you know, grandparents helping out with grandchildren, that this is your community, this is where your friends are. And it's a smaller and smaller group that wants to pick up stakes and move to another part of the country and start all over again. And part of that also, I think, is working longer. If you think about it, if you want to work and you're 65, it's going to be really hard to go through the portals. It's really hard to go through the traditional mechanisms. The way you get your job is through your network. It's the people who know you. And so I think there's a whole set of forces coming together where this sort of balance, this greater balance about respecting the elderly and valuing the elderly, I actually think we're starting to see that it's actually starting to show up in the society in some under-recognized ways.
Even a lot of the developers of walled, segregated communities in the past have started building these quote-unquote mother-in-law cottages, partly for home offices, but also for returning children and for parents to come. And the end result is a community that becomes multi-generational.
Yeah. And as you know, one thing, it is really striking. If you look at public radio, the growth audience is 60 and over.
Well, let us all thank Marc and Chris for a wonderful and very enlightening presentation.